Thank you for taking part in this brief Bible dive with Beautiful Savior Lutheran Church in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. I'm Pastor Nick and really grateful that you've joined us for this one. These brief Bible dives are a way that we, within 10 to 15 minutes, find a couple precious pearls and pull them out of the story. We never try to cover the entire story, but we find some precious pearls and then see how they would apply to our daily lives. Also, we'd encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, select to receive notifications. Usually it's by clicking on a little bell, and then you can find out when more things like this and other of our material or our worship times, whenever those things are uploaded. Today's brief Bible dive is going to focus on Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. So it's a pretty brief read here. And please also know that this is being read for this upcoming weekend's worship. It's the gospel that's being used for the sermon. We're beginning a Lenten series called Sacred Wounds of Christ. So, it sounds a little bit intense or heavy, but really during this worship series, we're going to look at the 5 ways that Jesus was physically wounded for us leading up to his death and right after his death, actually, in terms of his side with the spear. And then we're going to connect those wounds to our daily lives as well. But the first topic is Christ's back, since the first wound that he experienced was being whipped and scourged by the Roman army. For this brief Bible dive, we'll consider the following question throughout the time. What does it mean for Jesus to lighten the burdens I am carrying? What does it mean for Jesus to lighten the burdens I am carrying? We're using the New Revised Standard Version. This is what we use, the NRSV. It's what we tend to use the most at Beautiful Savior, but maybe you have another favorite translation in English. But here's the one, the reading from Matthew based off of that translation. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." Now, let's first get into what a yoke is. I was really confused about this as a kid. I used to think when I heard this, I'm like, what does this have to do with that yellow center of an egg? That's a yolk, Y-O-L-K. We're talking about a yoke, Y-O-K-E here. That's what Jesus is referencing. And a yoke is a harness that goes around the shoulders and neck of a person or animals, and it assists in pulling a load of some kind of weight. A yoke is designed to distribute the weight across the shoulders of whatever or whomever is wearing it. It really was not a comfortable image for people, of course, because it usually involved difficult and heavy work, and yet its purpose it was to lighten a load, or at least minimally lighten a load. Yokes were used for both animals and people in Jesus' time. So for animals, there were usually 2 animals standing side by side, each wearing their own yoke, and they would together pull a cart or a plow or some other type of farm instrument. For people, or rather I should say for a person, because it was usually a single person doing it, a single person would put on a yoke to carry their own type of farm instrument. It's probably obvious, but the reason that this imagery of a yoke was not always welcome is that the imagery of a yoke implied not only service, but sometimes servitude, whether willing servitude or unwilling servitude. Certainly, there are biblical images of more than one person wearing yokes and pulling a load side by side, but historically, that's not how it often happened on a little plot of land or a small farm. One of the well-known verses doesn't actually use the word yoke, but people attribute that word to it because of the imagery. When we hear in 2 Corinthians 6, chapter 6, verse 14, it states, quote, "Do not be mismatched with unbelievers, for what partnership is there between righteousness and lawlessness, or what fellowship is there between light and darkness?" Now, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't be friends with unbelievers or hang out with unbelievers or not, shouldn't work with unbelievers. What Paul was warning in his letter here, it had to do with a person of faith in Jesus marrying a person without faith in Jesus, or as he put it here, being mismatched. Now, the way that this has come down to us in modern English is you'll hear people say, oh, this verse is referring to people who are unequally yoked, and how that can be a reason for marriages sometimes not being successful. Of course, that's never a guarantee. A person of faith and a person not of faith could happily be married, and quite frankly, two people with faith could be very unhappily married. But it was a concern that he wanted to share with people. Paul also wrote in Philippians about struggling side by side one another in sharing the gospel. For example, in Philippians 4:3, he wrote, quote, "Yes, and I ask you also, my loyal companion, help these women, for they have struggled beside me in the work of the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are in the book of life." But there were other times that this imagery arose and specifically used the word yoke. So with these, it was sort of the imagery, but now the word pops up. For example, Luke described in Acts chapter 15 about the council in Jerusalem, where the church leadership gathered to debate whether a person needed to be circumcised to become a Christian. Should they first be circumcised, and then it would be okay, and they could be part of the church. And during this really heated discussion, Peter stood up and made the winning argument that circumcision was not necessary to be a Christian. And during this, what he said was, and we have it recorded in Acts 15, verse 10, using that yoke imagery, he's quoted as saying, "Now therefore, why are you putting God to the test by placing on the neck of the disciples a yoke that neither our ancestors nor we have been able to bear?" And of course, practically speaking, he probably knew that you could probably get a few more converts if you weren't telling adult males you got to get circumcised first. So there was a little bit of a practicality to this too. Now, perhaps more controversially, or most controversially, people tried to use Paul's words in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 1. And they try to use them to continue the horrible, sinful practice of slavery. Paul, in attempting to encourage slaves to be good witnesses of the gospel, wrote, quote, "Let all who are under the yoke of slavery regard their masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and the teaching may not be blasphemed." What he's really getting at here is he's just saying, be a good example. He's not saying slavery is okay. In fact, go read the book of Philemon, and you'll see he really did a lot to try to undo that sinful practice of slavery. But people like to take verses out of context, and a lot of people, especially in in early American history, before the Civil War, would take this verse out of context and say, you see, it's okay to have slaves, even though it's just not. Now, with all of this in mind, we heard Jesus say in verse 30, quote, "For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Now, what does he mean by this? Well, as Jesus reminded us, we all have masters of one sort or another. We all carry burdens, but the defining difference in terms of the burden is the master whom we are serving. And if we are serving Jesus as our master, our teacher, our leader, our friend, we will carry a lighter burden. There's actually a long Hebrew tradition referring to the yoke of the Torah, or the yoke of the law. And while at a superficial glance, that might seem to imply that the Torah, the law, was burdensome, that's really not what it meant. The deeper understanding was that the yoke of the Torah lightened people's loads and burdens in life as they learned knowledge and learned God's wisdom. So looking at then also that intertestamental literature, that's those books, those writings that fall between the Old and the New Testament, some people call it the Apocrypha, we can go to the wisdom book named Sirach, and we can hear there a whole ton about God's wisdom, God's teaching, and how they make life easier rather than harder. In referring to wisdom from God, Sirach 51, 26 through 27 says this: "Put your neck under her yoke and let your souls receive instruction. It is to be found close by. See with your own eyes that I have labored but little and found for myself much serenity." So in following Jesus's wisdom, as our teacher, in following Jesus, our master, we carry a lighter load in life because we're given wisdom on how to live better, how to live well, how to live wisely. Paul tells us of this in Galatians 5:1, where he writes, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery." Or again, as Jesus said in today's reading that we quoted, "Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." That brings us back to the question for this brief Bible dive. What does it mean for Jesus to lighten the burdens I am carrying? What does it mean for Jesus to lighten the burdens I am carrying? I mean, you know what burdens you are carrying more than anyone else. And sure, some people close to you may know of the burdens, but you know them deeply, intimately, personally. And Jesus is inviting you through this reading then to take up his yoke and let him help carry that burden. Take up his yoke, his teaching, to allow him to be our teacher and our master for the sake of our lives being better. Thank you again for joining with me, Pastor Nick, and with Beautiful Savior Lutheran Church for this brief Bible dive. If you want to learn more about our congregation, feel free to check out our website, bslcmi.org. That's bslcmi.org. And of course, we'd love for you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, select to receive notifications, and you'll find out when more things like this are posted online. Now, go out and love God and love your neighbors.